The focus on Reconstruction could begin. Although the military conflict had ended, Reconstruction was in many ways still a war. This important struggle was waged by radical Northerners who wanted to punish the South, and Southerners who desperately wanted to preserve their way of life. It is important to note that Reconstruction does not refer to the physical rebuilding of the South. That was left to the Southern states to do on their own, but to the political reconstruction of the South. There were 4 stages, 2 under presidential control and 2 under congressional control. Lincoln's plan for the political reconstruction of the South began as the Union began to capture significant sections of Confederate territory. His hope was that these areas could be brought back into the Union as quickly as possible. His plan to bring back the Southern states into the Union was very lenient. Southerners, with the exception of high-ranking Confederate officials, could take an oath promising future loyalty to the Union and an acceptance of the end of slavery. Once 10% of the number who had been registered to vote in 1860 swore the oath in any one state, a loyal state government could be formed there. Before his death, 3 states met that requirement. But radicals within the Republican Party, led by Thaddeus Stevens, refused to recognize the congressmen sent by those states. Radical Republican objections to Lincoln's plan was primarily that it didn't adequately punish the South for starting and carrying on the war. This represented a growing division in the Republican Party, those that wanted peace at all costs and those that wanted to inflict punishment on the Confederate rebels. With radicals growing in influence in Congress, they responded by passing the Wade-Davis bill. The proposed law would have removed the administration of Reconstruction from presidential control and put it solely in the hands of Congress. Their plan would have required an oath of loyalty to be sworn, but a state would need a majority of the voting population, again based on the 1860 census, to swear such an oath. In some areas of the South, due to war-related casualties, it was a number that would be impossible to meet unless former slaves were granted the right to vote. Since the bill was passed in the waning days of a legislative term, Lincoln simply refused to sign it, and the bill expired. This is called a pocket veto. Anticipating that the next Congress would probably propose something similar, compromise was going to have to be considered, but Lincoln's assassination ended that possibility. Slavery, in practical terms, died with the end of the Civil War. 3 constitutional amendments altered the nature of African American rights. The 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery in all states and territories. The 14th Amendment prohibited states from depriving any male citizen of equal protection under the law, regardless of race. The 15th Amendment granted the right to vote to African American males. Ratification of these amendments became a requirement for Southern states to be readmitted into the Union. Although these measures were positive steps towards racial equality, their enforcement proved extremely difficult. Andrew Johnson, as Lincoln's successor, also proposed a very lenient policy towards the South. He pardoned most Southern whites, appointed provisional governors, and outlined steps for the creation of new state governments. He felt that each state government could best decide how they wanted blacks to be treated, although eventually a requirement that states accept the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery, was included as part of his plan. Many in the North were infuriated that the South would be returning their former Confederate leaders to power. They were also alarmed by Southern adoption of black codes that sought to maintain white supremacy. Recently freed blacks found the post-war South to be very similar to the pre-war South. The congressional elections of 1866 ended up being a battle for who would control Reconstruction. Voters were often given a difficult choice: a radical Republican who wanted to punish the South severely, or a Copperhead Democrat who would be incredibly lenient to former Confederates. A strong campaign by the radical Republicans and widely publicized race riots, harsh black codes, and the election of many former Confederates to political office convinced many otherwise undecided to go ahead and vote radical Republican. With the overwhelming congressional win, not even a presidential veto could stop radical control of Reconstruction. The congressional elections of 1866 brought radical Republicans to power, and they wanted to punish the South and to prevent the ruling class from continuing in power. They passed the Military Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military districts and outlined how the new governments would be designed. Americans had long been suspicious of the federal government playing too large a role in the affairs of state, but the radicals felt that extraordinary times called for direct intervention in state affairs and laws designed to protect the emancipated blacks. At the heart of their beliefs was the notion that black Americans must be given a chance to compete in a free labor economy. Those who had recently been freed, received the right to vote, hold political office, positions that formerly had belonged to Southern Democrats. In 1866, this activist Congress also introduced a bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau and began work on a civil rights bill. But President Johnson stood in opposition. He vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau bill, claiming that it would bloat the size of the government. He vetoed the Civil Rights Bill, rejecting that black Americans had the same rights of property and person as whites. Moderate Republicans were appalled at Johnson's racism. They joined with the radicals to overturn Johnson's Civil Rights Act veto, and many in the South were aghast but could do little to stop the power of congressional Republicans. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which Edwin Stanton, as Secretary of War, was charged with enforcing. Johnson opposed the act and tried to remove Stanton, in direct violation of the Tenure of Office Act, which would require the approval of the Senate to remove appointed officials. In the spring of 1868, Andrew Johnson would become the first president to be impeached. The heavily Republican House of Representatives brought 11 articles of impeachment against him. Now, impeachment refers to the process specified in the Constitution for trial and removal from office of any federal official accused of misconduct. It has 2 stages: the House of Representatives charging the official with articles of impeachment, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors are defined as impeachable offenses. Once charged by the House, the case goes before the Senate for a trial. But as with politics, things are rarely simple. Other factors came into play. Since there was no vice president at the time, had Johnson actually been removed from office, the president pro tem of the Senate, Benjamin Wade, a radical Republican, who was unpopular with both moderate Republicans, businessmen, and of course Democrats, would have become president. In May of 1868, 35 senators voted to convict, 1 vote short of the required 2/3 majority. 10 Republican senators had jumped party lines and found Johnson not guilty, as had all 9 Democrats. Johnson had dodged a bullet and was able to serve out his term, but was very weakened politically. His non-removal from office may have been more of a reflection of Wade's unpopularity than a decision in favor of Johnson. It would be 130 years before another president, Bill Clinton, would be impeached. With no true party support, Johnson would most definitely not be renominated. The National Union Republican Party, the Radical Republicans, then nominated Ulysses S. Grant for president. The party's platform lauded congressional Reconstruction and promised payment of the national debt in gold. The Democratic Party nominated New York Governor Horatio Seymour. It called for a new departure and endorsed the so-called Ohio idea, which called for the repayment of national debt in greenbacks or paper money, a move that appealed to debtor elements, which would specifically include Eastern workers and Western farmers, who were suffering post-war deflation and had been since 1867. Grant would be victorious 218 to 80, but his popular margin was only 300,000 votes. Opponents noted that this was not a mandate for radical policy, because for the first time, there were 700,000 people of African descent who were voting, and presumably they all voted for Grant, which was why he'd won the election. The first 2 years of congressional Reconstruction saw Southern states rewrite their Constitution and the ratification of the 14th Amendment. Congress seemed fully in control. Only President Johnson had stood in the way, but his impeachment, even though he remained in office, limited any opposition. Many Southerners, whether white or black, rich or poor, barely recognized the world in which they now lived. Not all Southerners supported the radical Republicans. Many Southern whites could not accept the idea that former slaves could not only vote but hold office. Wealthy whites, long accustomed to plush plantation life and the perks of political power, now found themselves barred from voting and even holding office. Their estates were in shambles. African Americans were loath to return to work for them. and poor white farmers now found blacks competing with them for jobs and land. For the freed slave, Reconstruction offered a miraculous window of hope. Those born into slavery could now vote and own land. In parts of the South, they could ride with whites on trains, eat with them in restaurants. Schools, orphanage, and public relief projects aimed at improving the lives of blacks were emerging all over the South. Perhaps the most stunning of all is that African Americans were holding political office. They were becoming sheriffs and judges. They were elected to school boards and city councils. 16 African Americans sat in Congress from 1867 to 1877. And Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first African American senator in 1870. In December of 1872, P.B.S. Pinchback of Louisiana became the first African American governor. All in all, about 600 African Americans served as legislators on a local level. But as the saying goes, the more things change, the more they remain the same. Economically, African Americans were disadvantaged. Most had skills best suited to the plantation. By the early 1870s, sharecropping became the dominant way for the poor to earn a living. Wealthy whites allowed poor whites and blacks to work the land in exchange for a share of the harvest. The landlord would sometimes provide food, seeds, tools, and shelter. Sharecroppers often found themselves in debt, for they had to borrow on bad terms and had to pay excessively for basic supplies. When the harvest came, if the debt exceeded harvest revenues, the sharecropper remained bound to the owner, in many ways the system resembling slavery. Many whites resented and rejected the changes taking place all about them. Taxes were high, the economy was stagnant, corruption ran rampant. Carpetbaggers and scalawags made matters worse. Carpetbaggers being Northerners who saw the shattered South as a chance to get rich quickly by seizing political office, now barred from the old order. After the war, these Yankees had hastily packed old-fashioned traveling bags, called carpetbags, and rushed south. And scalawags were Southern whites who allied themselves with the carpetbaggers and also took advantage of the political openings.